So our first speaker this morning, the second day of the first annual R20 Summit of International Religious Leaders, we have a very distinguished guest, Rabbi Alan Brill, a gentleman who grew up in America, I believe in New York City, within the modern Orthodox tradition of Judaism. He will be talking to some extent about his personal life background and how that impacts his perception of an extremely significant document that was released by the conservative or Masorti Jewish movement, a member of which, Rabbi Silvina Chemin of Argentina, will speak after Rabbi Brill addresses you. Rabbi Brill is a professor at Seton Hall University. He is a professor he will describe this in more detail, but I will just say from my point of view, one of the things that's very interesting about Rabbi Brill, he is both a remarkable intellect and he is a mystic. And so he's integrating both the intellectual, the mastery of the traditional legal aspects of Judaism in terms of halakha, and then also the spiritual dimensions of Judaism. And I think when you hear him speak, I think you will understand just how valuable it is when these elements come together. If I may, Rabbi, invite you to speak.
Good morning. Selamat pagi. I would like to thank the Indonesian government for sponsoring this event, and I'd like to say thank you to the two co-chairs of the event. 20 years ago, I wrote a paper which became a widely influential book called Judaism and Other Religions, showing that Jewish texts do not present a sharp choice between traditional intolerant exclusivism or non-traditional secular pluralism. Rather, I showed a rich panorama of inclusive, exclusive, universal Jewish texts from one extreme to the other. I collected the opinions that were out there. The Talmud, a classic of rabbinic Judaism, has passages that are both pro-Gentile but also anti-Gentile. I show that the tradition has passages that are appreciative of members of other religions and passages that are not. Jewish law has positions that are humanistic as well as non-humanistic passages. But the important thing of my book was that we have to choose the former, the humanistic in each case. I stress the universal and inclusive models as models for today. The jurist who deals in religious law will feel more comfortable finding an inclusive place for other religions within a legal definition of believers, while the mystic will feel comfortable finding a place for other religions in the universal mystic oneness of the divine beyond all reality. For comprehensiveness, I included Jewish exclusive text. I went out of my way to include the exclusivist passages rarely discussed in modern times in order to encourage communities to explicitly deal with them by rejecting them. I reminded people of the exclusivism of certain sections of Kabbalah, denying the humanity of non-Jews, and the invoking visions of eschatological destruction. Yet I also showed how contemporary movements went from denying souls to Gentiles in the 18th century to 20th century thinking that all Americans, Jewish and Gentile, are one nation under God, working together to redeem the world. Now, before going further with discussing problematic texts, I want to situate myself. My family comes from Poland, having survived the pogroms, assimilation, and the Holocaust, and they followed a Jewish historic pattern of fleeing persecution. My upbringing was in the tolerant United States, where Jews were considered with the same rights as Protestants and Catholics, even though Jews were only a small percentage of the population. I live in New York City, which greater New York City is the largest Jewish city in the world, and I was able to take advantage of the 20th century liberal tolerance of the United States. Furthermore, I live in a post-Vatican II era in which the important 1965 document Nostra Aetate renounced anti-Semitism. And in the years following Nostra Aetate, there was an era of reconciliation between Judaism and Christianity after the Holocaust, with Christian churches seeking to express their rejection of prior teachings of contempt toward Judaism. Decades later, Pope John Paul II went further and acknowledged Judaism as a living religion, acknowledged the state of Israel, and acknowledged the tragedy of the Holocaust. But furthermore, I have a doctorate in Catholic theology, and I currently teach interfaith in a Catholic university. Both would have been unheard of 70 years ago. Just as the church changed and the United States changed, my Judaism changed from a fearful immigrant traditionalism to a strident American modern orthodoxy. As a native-born American, the Jewish language switched from Yiddish to English. My generation attended college. We lost our fear of Gentiles. We went from a folky traditionalism to a text-based religion. I grew up in an era when I expected Judaism to also embrace the changes. My teachers taught me a tolerant universal Judaism. I was never taught any intolerant texts or ideas, and I would have never expected some obscure text to return in the 21st century. But the intolerant text did return in the 21st century. In 2016, a document produced by the Rabbinic Law Committee of Conservative Judaism moved my descriptive collection of texts in my book to the prescriptive. They dealt directly with two related issues: the return of exclusive texts in the 21st century and the extremism found in the state of Israel and elsewhere. And this is the document that Pachaya was referring to in his opening remarks as an exemplar. The 2016 document, called the Tshuva in Hebrew, and it's the equivalent process of writing a fatwa answering a contemporary question. It was entitled The Status of Non-Jews in Jewish Law, and it was written by Rabbi Reuven Hammer, who unfortunately recently passed away. The Rabbinic Law Committee directly asked, what is the status of Gentiles in Jewish law, and how should we deal with statements in traditional Jewish literature that are negative or discriminatory? The tshuva, or this rabbinic fatwa, answers emphatically, I quote, "The Torah teaches the equality of all human beings created in the image of God and is positive toward non-Israelites. Rabbinic literature similarly contains numerous positive statements about Gentiles. Nevertheless," it continues, "it cannot be denied that there are passages in rabbinic literature, Kabbalah, and medieval philosophic works that depict Gentiles in negative terms as inferior to Jews and sometimes even less than human. According to the tshuva," I quote again, "many of these negative statements and depictions can be explained as normal reactions and exceedingly cruel treatment of Jews by non-Jews, be it in the Roman Empire or the Church. Some, however, go far beyond that, positing an exclusivist theology. Dealing with discriminatory laws and negative texts when teaching our tradition to youth and adults can be problematic, to say nothing of how we deal with them when we're interacting with others. This has become particularly acute today, where Jews are in constant contact with non-Jews and enjoy equal rights and equal status. And at the same time, when other groups, such as the Catholic Church, are re-examining their attitudes toward Jews and others and making changes in their doctrines to eliminate negative doctrines, we can hardly do less. The responses cites the universal Jewish tradition in which I was raised. It teaches that if one destroys one person, it is accounted to him as if he had destroyed the entire world. And if one sustains one life, it is accounted to him as if he had sustained the entire world. I know that Islam has a very similar statement in the Quran. The same concept of equality of all human beings was expressed by the 2nd century Rabbi Ben Azai, that the verse, when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. And it's the most important general rule of the Torah because it shows the divinity of all humanity. The response emphasized that most modern Jews were taught a universal ethic. Prominent attitudes such as Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch in the 19th century took it as granted that love your neighbor applied to all the people of the world. a widely used biblical commentary in the English countries by Chief Rabbi Joseph Hertz went out of his way to show Judaism's universality, and you could find many other rabbis who will say similar things. But the 21st century offers new challenges. The response continues. However, in recent years, there's a new challenge. The recent statements of radical Jewish groups who produce books lauded by a small number of well-known extremist rabbis in which non-Jews are depicted as being a lesser species and in which slaying enemies, including young children, is deemed permissible and even commandment. They say the so-called halakhic positions of these rabbis have influenced fanatical groups of extremists and have led to acts of destruction, injury, and death. The tshuva acknowledges that one can find exclusive and negative passages in the tradition if one looks. One can justify bad acts from the tradition, but the tshuva outright condemns these works and all works by exclusive Jewish groups. The document declares that all rules discriminating in matters of civil nature and moral action are no longer to be considered authoritative in Judaism, not only because of the harm to the image of Judaism or to its relation with non-Jews, but because these texts are intrinsically immoral and deter us from attaining the honest virtues to which we aspire. With some satisfaction on my part, the response then quotes passages from my books in which I stated, Jews have barely begun to look at their attitudes toward other faiths, albeit this reluctance was forged in the era of persecution, but Jews do not look or not used to looking at their problematic and nasty texts about Gentiles. They ignore their own traditional visions of destruction of others at the end of days, and they frequently stigmatize other faiths in a totalizing way. They judge other faiths by the worst and cite Judaism at the best. The problem of the era is that some Jews consider Jewish extremists as aberrations and non-Jewish extremists as the norm. They cite modern sanitized Jewish approaches that show how wonderful and tolerant Judaism is toward others, and then disown their own anti-Gentile texts written over the millennium. At the same time, however, they assume that other faiths are shackled to their prior texts as understood in prior ages, and do not allow the possibility that other religions have modern understandings of themselves. Meaning, what I was trying to say is that many assume that others can't change, even if not with that self-consciousness that if you're changing, others can change also. If we are not to descend to the level of simple apologetics, it will be necessary to deal honestly with the sources, to admit that different attitudes existed over the course of the development, and to candidly criticize and reject certain parts of the tradition while embracing others as representative of the Judaism we wish to promulgate and which we believe represents the true core of Jewish belief itself. Turning to the second issue of extremism in the state of Israel, the document also addresses this new reality, and I quote, "For the first time in thousands of years, a Jewish state governs the lives of non-Jews. Jews constitute the majority and must deal with the status of non-Jewish minority. Even though Jewish law is not the civil law of Israel, which is built on Anglo and European laws, it is influential and has been used by state-appointed rabbis to make determinations about the rights of non-Jews. Such negative teachings have led to halachic decisions condoning violence. The result has been discrimination and violence against non-Jews and the destruction of Gentile houses of worship, both Christian and Muslim, when extremists take it upon themselves to translate what they perceive to be Jewish law into violent actions. Therefore, they conclude, it's imperative that we condemn these new radical works and leaders." End of their responsa. But personally, as an American Jew, I find these Western condemnations written in America of radical positions written in Israel as not really having an effect. Talk by Western Jews in the United States can sometimes be treated quite cheaply, that Israelis may not be particularly concerned with American Jewish views, and in some way, this is similar to how Western Muslims, some living in Europe or in the United States, who may be universalistic, who have written many universalist books, but their thought is not necessarily compelling in their home countries where they come from. The Jewish laws of war, collateral damage, civilian control have never been seriously developed in Jewish law. Jews lived under Islam and Christianity. And these new violent books are original new readings of Bronze Age biblical books of Joshua and Judges outside of any rabbinic tradition developed in the last 2 millennia, meaning they're outside of even the traditional texts. We in America, we can gladly read humanistic interpretations of Jewish law, even discussions of Jewish laws of war written by progressive thinkers such as Michael Walzer, or many a liberal jurist has tried their hand, a liberal Jewish jurist has tried their hand at dealing with producing a humanistic or progressive Jewish polity. Now, this document by the Rabbinic Assembly should not be treated as rare or unique. A decade ago, many Jewish documents came out at the same time condemning the return to exclusivist texts and Bronze Age war practices. For example, there's a 144-page rebuttal of the right-wing documents, but it's in Hebrew, so it's less useful in this context. But no, many books came out. There were many Jewish leaders from progressive to Orthodox condemned these exclusivist views, and the ideas of the radical Jewish groups were also condemned by many Talmudic scholars, and they were actually taken also to litigation in the secular courts to prevent them from being promulgated. So, for example, the Elijah Interfaith Institute produced a document called Affirming the Image of God. And I'm citing specifically that one because Rabbi Arthur Green, who will be speaking later today, and I both signed on to this document. And it's got a slightly different tone to it. The document states, recent weeks and months have brought to public attention the issue of Jewish attitudes to non-Jews, as these are found in some traditional sources, particularly with reference to this new book, Torah HaMelech. The great liberty which the author dispenses with the life of non-Jews under various circumstances has become a scandal in the media, a subject for police investigation, a discussion item on anti-Semitic websites, and the subject of an appeal to the Supreme Court of Israel. In our understanding, the creation of humanity in God's image is the greatest principle, as our sages recognized. We believe this mandates full respect for the infinite value, equality, and uniqueness of every human being, for it is created in the image of God, and that our Torah's ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. Love of one's own group should not be equated with the hatred of others. Israel's call is to harmonious and well-being of all humanity, and we recognize that there are voices in our tradition that have lost sight of those great principles. It is therefore a contemporary educational and religious law challenge to confront these extremist teachings, to contain them, to dissent from them publicly, apply the methods of the study of Jewish law, of classical interpretation, and historic study. Accordingly, and this document ends, we call upon rabbis and educators to take a clear stand against narrow views of Jewish particularity in favor of a broader vision of Judaism's relationship to the other. Our scholars stand ready to debate the views under discussion. We need to be reminded that the Lord is good to all and his compassion extends to all creatures. In conclusions, the responsa and other doctrines that were written against exclusivist Jewish texts teach us that we need to teach inclusivist and universal positions and reject exclusivist positions in our schools at all levels, in our teacher colleges, in sermons by major clergy, with the goal to have moderate positions to be eternalized at grassroots level. Traditional religions, however, travel heavy and do not throw texts away. They may think that they do not use a given problematic text anymore, so they lay it aside, but it returns. And in every generation, maybe we have to reread it again and again for the context of that generation. The important point is that the universalism that I was taught when I was in school has been, can be, overturned in a later generation if we're not vigilant in teaching the universal parts of our traditions and openly rejecting the exclusive and prejudiced parts. In conclusion, I will close with a quote from Chief Rabbi of the British Empire, Lord Jonathan Sacks, who extolled the power of interfaith understanding. He taught, "We are blessed, and to be blessed, no one has to be cursed. God's love does not work that way. Today, God is calling us to let go of hate and the preaching of hate, and live at last as brothers and sisters, true to our faith and a blessing to others, regardless of their faith, honoring God's name by honoring his image, humankind." Fidelity to one's own faith need not involve an adversarial attitude to people of other faiths. Creating an inclusive traditional approach that allows for working together is a much more powerful force for building shared civilizations than working alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Brill. On behalf of Kahaji Yair Stakuf, who knows about this teshuvah, who knows about you and your work, we're deeply grateful to you, not just for coming here and being with us and sharing this very important analysis and history, but also for the vital role that you played in the creation of this teshuvah. The next speaker will be Rabbi Silvina Chemin, who is at a synagogue. She has a synagogue in Buenos Aires, Rome. Most of us here probably know that Pope Francis is from Buenos Aires. Silvina knows Pope Francis. And she is herself a rabbi within the Masorti, the conservative Orthodox tradition that created this teshuvah that Rabbi Brill just described. She also is a member of the Rabbinical Assembly, which created that document. She will speak to us now about how she views and how she practices and how she teaches the implementation of this teshuvah, which is actually the emergence of this teshuvah. The writing of the teshuvah was written by the Masorti movement because it very much reflects their approach to recontextualizing the religious texts in light of current circumstances. This is an approach that has historically been practiced within what we here call Nusantara, the land between the islands, the islands between the water, the archipelago, the Malay archipelago. And Nahdlatul Ulama later on was just anticipation. Kai Haji Ulil Abshar Abdallah will later be speaking about what the Nahdlatul Ulama is doing in this regard. And Kai Imam from the Muhammadiyah, another organization here, I'll speak more when he comes to the stage, but we have a number of people on this stage who are actively implementing within their faith traditions an idea that the Rabbinical Assembly itself is practicing and setting a stage for. So, Rabbi Chemin, if you would come to the stage.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by expressing my gratitude to Mr. Holland Taylor, who believed that my voice should be heard at this distinguished gathering, and to Dr. Timothy Shah and Nahdlatul Ulama for taking such loving care to make this possible. It truly is an honor and a privilege to address all of you gathered here today. My name is Silvina Chemen. I am a rabbi of Betel congregation in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The tradition I belong to, as it was mentioned, is called Masorti, a pluralistic, egalitarian, and democratic movement among the Jewish people. I am a pacifist and a human rights activist. As you can see, I am a woman rabbi, a minority in the male-dominated rabbinical world, who lives in Argentina, which is not the most powerful country in the world. My voice, then, is that of the common people, who are in fact those most reliant upon our traditions to improve and defend their lives. So let me thank you for giving a space to the people that need us to be united and strong, that need us to provide answers to the despair that surrounds us. I'm deeply moved by the realization that the R20 is being held prior to the G20 summit, because I understand that religions have much to offer humanity beyond worship and activities within our temples, mosques and sanctuaries. Our sacred sources, the teachings of our ancestors and our faiths call upon us to seek peace and justice, to build ties of solidarity, to reinforce hope in humanity, where each and every human being can see himself as the guarantor of the life of his fellow without distinctions. New conflicts between people, ethnicities, or religious expressions challenge us to read our sacred texts and find within them the seed for dialogue and peace with our neighbors. And here we are, gathered in the hope that the speeches heard in this forum will shed light on decisions made by the rulers of the world's most powerful nations. Let us not forget, decisions can be transformed into opportunities for a better life, for human rights, for a just economy, and for peaceful coexistence in our wounded and battered world. Rabbi Brill already introduced us to the emblematic document titled The Status of Non-Jews in Jewish Law and Law Today. This remarkable document is endowed with rabbinic legal authority, and it stands in stark opposition to another document called Torat HaMelech, or the King's Law. Torat HaMelech was written by a few extremist rabbis, and it abuses Jewish sources to justify the commission of murder. Indeed, it is a manual on how Jewish law can be used to justify hatred and violence. I am here to share with you a peculiarity of the Jewish tradition that can help us think about all of our religious traditions. This peculiarity is called, as it was mentioned, a teshuvah, also mentioned yesterday by Pakiahia, a response, a reaction to a religious edict, a document that answers another document, because the status of non-Jews in Jewish law and law today is a teshuvah that finds justifications within the Jewish sources that forbid us from harming any person and instead advocate brotherhood and coexistence. It is my privilege to share with you the Jewish path of interpretation, so that you may understand how it is possible for a rabbinical statement to be confronted and contradicted, shedding light on sources that promote understanding and social peace rather than hatred and violence. I want to talk to you about the Jewish tradition as an interpretative tradition, a living tradition that, as critical perspectives of social reality change, can and should revisit its fundamental text to find answers that strengthen and solidify the most noble ethics purposes. Judaism is a tradition that precedes modernity. It is a challenge, therefore, to read our tradition in light of the unique realities lived at each time and in each place. Since God's revelation of the Torah, also known as the Pentateuch, we are summoned to read and reread, examine and re-examine His words, because divine truth is not fossilized in a historical era, but rather requires us to listen again to the voice of heaven in the face of each dilemma that life throws at us. The sacred encourages us to continue questioning ourselves so that the divine voice may manifest according to the circumstances of each time and place. Let me share with you one of the teachings that inspires this path of reinterpretation and recontextualization of the sources. It is written in the Torah, I quote, "These are the statutes, ordinances, and laws that the Lord established between himself and the Israelites through Moses on Mount Sinai." Leviticus 26:46. It is clear the Bible is a compendium of laws and ordinances, but the word in Hebrew for laws is Torot, the plural of the word Torah. How is this possible? Didn't God give a single Torah, a single revealed text? Our masters noticed this dilemma and explained its significance in an exegetical text called a Midrash. They said that at Mount Sinai, 2 Torah were given, 2 sacred laws, one written and the other oral. And they continued asking, what is the oral Torah, the oral law? The answer they found was all the updates and interpretations that all generations until the end of time will make to the text. This is especially important. Every interpretation for every period was revealed on the day the law was given, and every word must be inscribed sacredly in its historical time. From the very beginning, our tradition has understood that the Torah was written by God for all Jews and for all times. This is how the first great Jewish interpretative document, the Talmud, was created. The Talmud is a compilation of centuries and centuries of oral traditions, of rabbinical schools that discussed and found new insights revealed by the existential questions posed in each time and place where Jewish communities settled in exile. From God's revelation of the Torah until today, the Jewish tradition, in its various expressions, continues to create new literature based upon the new interpretations required to remain faithful to the spirit of the law, so that the ancient teachings that maintain their original vitality and relevance to every time and place. Studying the sacred texts over and over again implies a continuous revelation of the Torah's teaching. It requires us to comply with the law, but also forces us to question ourselves if, as we understand, we are pursuing the law's true purposes. The text becomes alive and current. It speaks to us and moves us forward toward the harmonious world of all of us yearn for. Already in the first century, there were 2 interpretative schools that claim sole ownership of the truth, the followers of Rabbi Hillel and the followers of Rabbi Shammai, and each school opposed the other in their decrees and definitions. The Talmud describes them as follows. The scriptures say, these words, those words, all words have been given by a shepherd and come from the Lord of creation, blessed be he. So procure yourself a heart of many quarters to house the words of the school of Shammai and the words of the school of Hillel. For us Jews, the Teshuvah is a category of document with ancient origins that it's both a legal document and a means of keeping alive awareness by posing the questions necessary to arrive at fruitful answers. Teshuvah comes from the need of the people to be tied to the essence of God's voice by continuing to ask and inquire in every time and place. And this methodology is called She'elot Utshuvot, which literally translated means questions and answers. As Teshuvah is a legal response, however, a better translation of this methodology could be interpellations and decisions. When a person or a congregation doubts how to behave or proceed in a particular situation, they present a question to a rabbi or court of rabbis who issue a response, a teshuva, that remains in force as a legal decision for future generations. In my case, the movement I belong to has a committee on Jewish law and standards composed of prominent rabbis and scholars that sets legal policy for the Masorti movement as a whole. Throughout the history of the Jewish community, many teshuvot or responses were written and have become part of the cultural and religious heritage of our people. It is important to point out that the inclusion of women rabbis and women jurists in legal discussions and decisions is a new phenomenon only reached by the Masorti movement in the 80s and by modern Orthodoxy 25 years later, and still the battle is not done. Throughout the centuries, the primary functions of rabbis was not given sermons, conduct marriages, or eulogize the dead, but to rule on matters of Jewish law, the halakha. To perform these functions, rabbis invoked superior principles to make a revision to the source on ethical grounds. These superior principles include mishum eiva, on account of hatred. This principle allows rabbis to avoid carrying out actions that, though legally correct, would offend people or cause strife. Or the principle of darkei shalom, the ways of peace, will require certain behaviors, even if they are not what pure halakha would like or demand, to avoid quarrels or confrontations. Another important principle is tikkun olam, establishing the world aright, healing humanity's wounds so that we are able to live according to our religion while also respecting the faiths of all. And we also have the principle of darkei noam, the ways of pleasantness. Rabbis use this precept to avoid insisting on certain strict legal practices if they have unpleasant consequences. In our sacred texts, in the book of Deuteronomy 6:18, it is written, "You shall do the straight and the good in the eyes of God." To do the right and the good in every time and place require us to adhere to the covenant and given laws, but for a covenant to continue, to have a binding force upon our behaviors, the spirit in which it was originally written must be translated into our current era. The Talmud cites this verse, "You shall do the straight and the good in the eyes of God," as the source for the importance of acting beyond the strict requirements of the law, beyond the strict requirements of the law. To behave beyond the letter of the law requires us to make an active commitment not to hide behind sources, to enjoin us to betray the main principles of ethics and morality. Adhering to the spirit of the law inspires us to struggle against fundamentalism and extremism, which is a real threat to human expressions in our fragile world. It is upon this basis that we should understand the mentioned teshuva. Scripture can become a living covenant when we fulfill God's boundless mandate to be a holy people. This holy people is in reality the entire humankind, which deserves to live in peace, freedom, and justice. Tarimakazi, shukran, toda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Chemin. Our next speaker is from the United States, from a community that not everyone here is familiar with, but which emerged in the United States in the 19th century. His name is Elder Gary Stevenson. He belongs in the group of 12 apostles who govern the church. Its headquarters is in Salt Lake City, Utah, in the Intermountain region in western United States. He is going to speak about how his church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, have dealt with the context of changing reality which his community has faced over the past 180 years, or 200 years probably, since its founding. So Elder Stevenson, if you would share your experiences, I'm sure everyone here will be fascinated to hear.
Thank you so very much. My distinguished colleagues and friends, it is an honor to address you. We gather from around the world as ecclesiastical leaders, spiritual guides, and scholars of various religions, religious beliefs to share the perspectives of this global work of building peace. We face many challenges, but one of the tests of a successful society is to learn from the past and accept new light and knowledge that comes into the world. Religion is no different. We all learn from one another, from our past and from our present. May I begin quoting Joseph Smith, founding prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who said that we should receive all truth, let it come from whence it may. As an apostle of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I represent a faith with the singular purpose, the salvation of all God's children. A book of scripture we follow teaches that God's work and glory is to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man. Accomplishing that takes time. It is like a tree sprouting from a seed and growing into its potential. Religion progresses towards its full stature. Every religion has a story, and typically it is established in a particular time and place. Religious institutions initially focus inward as they lay the foundation of their own beliefs and organization. The unfolding Latter-day Saint story includes the search for harmony among our neighbors. Persecuted by mobs and driven from our homes, we migrated from place to place, seeking refuge to practice our religion in peace. We eventually settled in a corner of the American West, similar to other religious faiths and traditions of that era. There existed among early Latter-day Saints a fear of outside groups, unease about racial differences, and the apprehension of the influence of the prevailing culture. Notwithstanding our past, Latter-day Saints rely on foundational doctrine of continuing revelation, wherein knowledge unfolds line upon line, precept upon precept, as we strive to understand and live the will of the Lord. A significant essay on this topic explains that, quote, as the church grew worldwide, its overarching mission to go ye therefore into all nations seemed increasingly incompatible with priesthood and temple restrictions. The fact that full participation of Latter-day Saints of African descent was not possible became the focus of much prayer and fasting to understand the divine direction of the Lord. Through earnest petitioning over many years, the will of the Lord was revealed to the President of the Church in 1978, and all church privileges were extended to every worthy man, woman, and child. Members of the church, as I did, wept and rejoiced at the coming of this long-awaited day. In 2018, to commemorate the anniversary of the revelation, President Dallin H. Oaks of our first presidency described the significance of the change. Quote, many Latter-day Saints felt joy at this news. The numbers of valiant and faithful members of African descent who had accepted the gospel despite the restrictions was very small. Therefore, most of those who rejoiced were Anglo-Americans like me who witnessed the pain of black brothers and sisters and longed for their relief. The church reacted swiftly to the revelation on the priesthood. Ordinations and temple recommends came immediately. The reasons that had been given to try to explain the prior restrictions on members of African ancestry were promptly and publicly disavowed. Changes in the hearts and practices of individual members did not come suddenly and universally. Some accepted the effects of the revelation immediately and gratefully. Some accepted gradually. Some, in their personal lives, continued the attitudes of racism that have been painful to so many throughout the world. One of the most important effects of the revelation on the priesthood is its divine call to abandon attitudes of prejudice against any of God's children. Racism is probably the most familiar source of prejudice today, and we're all called to repent of that. Close quote. This revelation has been a great blessing to all church members, and we have been lifted and strengthened by the full participation of all of God's children. We have strengthened our priorities towards serving others and celebrating unity in diversity. Our shared values with people of faith have compelled us to build bridges of interfaith understanding, foster relationships of racial harmony, and promote fairness for all throughout society, as well as to collaborate with global humanitarian organizations. Giving to those in need is a principle of all Abrahamic religions, and in others as well. A few months ago, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints reported for the first time the extent of our humanitarian work worldwide. Our 2021 expenditures for those in need in 188 countries worldwide totaled $906 million, almost $1 billion US. In addition, our members volunteered over 6 million hours of labor in the same cause. The effort to engage in meaningful dialogue fuels trust. We have participated in conferences, events, discussions, and private talks with members of many races, ethnicities, and cultures. Listening to the human experience of others and sharing one's own journey leads to deeper understanding and respect. In this way, we strive to move ever closer to the universal ideal that all are alike unto God. By collaborating with our African American friends and government and religious leaders across Africa, we work to build those bridges of understanding spoken by President Oaks. As part of this broader effort, we have undertaken significant cultural exchanges, granted educational scholarships. Altogether, these are helping us create a brighter future together. Overcoming ignorance starts by understanding. To that end, we recently collaborated with Muslim friends to publish a booklet that helps people understand the similarities rather than the differences between Muslims and Latter-day Saints. This shows how the common beliefs, values, and practices in both faiths extend beyond political, ethnic, or cultural boundaries. Interestingly enough, our experience shows that religion can best provide solutions when they hold true to their core principles while also being guided by additional divine light and knowledge. When citizens learn to live together with respect and unity despite religious differences, we have the foundational stones of true peace. A fellow apostle stated, Catholics, evangelicals, Jews, Muslims, Latter-day Saints, and other faiths must be part of a coalition of faiths that succor, act as a sanctuary, and promulgate religious freedom across the world. The hard work of harmony is worth the effort it requires. President Russell M. Nelson, President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, expressed this goal, quote, solutions will come as we open our hearts to those whose lives are different than our own, as we work to build bonds of genuine friendship, as we see each other as brothers and sisters we are, for we are all children of a loving God. The gospel of Jesus Christ calls on us to love people of all faiths, cultures, races, and nations for the common good. All are alike unto God. As one called to be a witness of Jesus Christ and promote the peace and love he taught, I testify of his divinity and invoke divine blessings on all who seek to serve God. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Thank you, Elder Stevenson. Our next speaker first came to my awareness several years ago when a very close friend, both of Bishop Kuka and of mine, a gentleman named Andrew Walter, who was the vice president of the Knights of Columbus, a fraternal organization of American Catholics, sent me a homily that Bishop Kuka had written that he delivered perhaps to tens of thousands of Roman Catholics who gathered for the funeral. Pardon me if I cry, because I cried when I read this homily that he delivered. He delivered the homily for the funeral of a seminarian of the Diocese of the Catholic Church of Sokoto in northern Nigeria. That gentleman, the seminarian, I believe, might have been around 18 years old. He was kidnapped. He was tortured, and he was killed, and his body was thrown away as if it was trash. You can imagine the pain that this caused to his community. You can imagine. And Bishop Kuka delivered a funeral homily. It's remarkable in its touching qualities and its call for everyone in the face of such problems to take personal responsibility. I shared that homily with the chairman of Nahdlatul-Ulama, Kyai Haji Yahulistakov, who read it as well. We've had an eye, so to speak, on Bishop Kuka ever since. We feel honored that he has come here to be with us today. I'm sorry to say that the kind of violence that he described several years ago is continuing today in Nigeria and many other parts of the world. And so this purpose, the purpose of the R20 is, as Pat Yaya says, as the organization states, the R20 Forum, to strive so that religion may serve as a genuine and dynamic source of solutions rather than problems in the 21st century. Reverend Kuka, if you would please.
Thank you very much. It just remains for me to add my voice to the voices of so many people who have spoken before me about the honor and the privilege of standing here before such a wonderful audience. I wish that I had better news to deliver to you about my country and a lot of other countries in Africa and around the world. In an earlier statement that I made at the United States Congress in July last year, I summarized my country, Nigeria, in the following words, and I just crave your indulgence to repeat them. I said, from its inception as an independent nation, Nigeria has remained a volatile country, home to over 200 million people, highly resourceful, but endemically corrupt, a combination of serious governance missteps, series of military coups, years of maladministration, a culture of violence have seriously slowed down what would have been one of the greatest nations on earth. It has left its people vulnerable to poverty, disease, violence, and death. Here is the enigma about this great country called Nigeria. Amidst all of this, in 2014, the World Value Survey ranked Nigerians, in spite of all their woes, as the happiest people in the world. Today, a combination of local and global factors of terrorism have further pushed the country to the precipice. After well over 10 years of battling Boko Haram, insurgency, banditry, ethno-religious violence, our weary citizens are absorbed in self-doubt, their natural happiness clouded by the dark clouds of despair. And every day, news of abductions, armed robberies, kidnappings for ransom, murders and assassination of our innocent citizens persist. Our sacred places of worship have become killing fields. Hundreds of worshippers have been murdered in mosques and churches across the country. In response to much of the world, in response to all of this, most of the world tends to simply shrug its shoulders and moves on, as if this cauldron of violence in Africa's most populated country will never reach comfortable people elsewhere in the world. Against this background, I applaud this conference for taking the historic step to address the issues directly. I specifically commend the goal of this conference, which is, quote, to prevent the weaponization of identity and combat the spread of hatred, end of quote. In reality, the reality which confronts us, so many of us today, hatred feeds on the weaponization of identity. It marginalizes the other and creates the condition for the dehumanization of all of us all, an inevitability that takes us to the dark road of the justification of violence and ultimately murder. I speak to this theme, as many others have before me, with a lot of anxiety. The Nigerian story of the weaponization of religion has been characterized by the manipulation of historical narratives between Christians and Muslims, and setting ethnic groups against one another. Most Muslims in northern Nigeria have continued to re-echo sentiments of the old caliphate, which existed for 100 years between 1804 and 1903, which views Christianity as a foreign religion, while dismissing that Islam itself originated from the Arab Peninsula. The result, of course, is that Christians in northern Nigeria today find that their faith is in danger, both physically and socially, even within developed municipalities. Christian religious tradition and history is prohibited in most public schools, whereas Islamic religious fundamentals are everywhere required in the same schools. Therefore, except for the very poor, Christians do not send their children to public schools in most parts of northern Nigeria. Occasionally, deserving Christian students complain that they are often denied admissions and places in many universities despite their qualifications. In cases of employment and promotion, even indigenous Christians suffer basically the same feelings of exclusion. Compounding this structural persecution of Christians in northern Nigeria, we have witnessed a growing culture of overt Islamic violence spalling over the decades, a form of violence that now threatens most of Africa. This violence has been manifested in Nigeria in two distinct phases. First, the intra-religious violence such as that between different sects within Islam itself, namely the Sunni, the Shiites, Izala, Boko Haram, ISWAP, and others. Second is the violence by Muslim extremists that direct and target Christians or their infrastructure, such as churches, presbyteries, convents, schools, hospitals, and even social structures for public use, such as pastoral centers. We suffered this fate most recently in my diocese, Sokoto, which is in the far northwest of northern Nigeria, and it's also the seat of the old caliphate. Many of you, I'm sure, heard about the brutal murder of Deborah Samuel, a young Christian student who was accused of blasphemy and publicly murdered on the campus on May 13, 2022, by her fellow Muslim students who complained of the forced introduction of religion, who complained that she had blasphemed against the Prophet. Far from universal condemnation of this horrific act, many Islamic extremists applauded the murder, claiming that it was justified and calling for additional violence against anyone who might ask for legal justice against the perpetrators. This is despite the condemnation of this act by the governor of the state, the Sultan who is the leader of the Muslim community in Nigeria, and my humble self. With this rise of Islamic extremism, we've seen a spread in the abductions and kidnappings of clerics across the board. While we have cases of abductions of very visible Muslim clerics in some parts of northern Nigeria, especially in the northeast and the northwest, the abductions of senior Christian churchmen has been far more pronounced, targeted, and vicious. In the course of this, my diocese of Sokoto, we've had one of our priests and a seminarian who was referred to, murdered by bandits. 4 more of my priests were kidnapped, and 2 pastoral agents were kidnapped. Only last week was one released. These persons have been held at various places across the country, and very often, as it is the case, the security agencies look the other way, while hapless families, churches have to negotiate with bandits, paying millions of dollars that we can ill afford. I'd like to conclude my comments by making a few observations. First, for us in Africa, the weak infrastructure of the state has predisposed our public office holders to corruption on a truly monumental scale. Governance is seen as state capture, where the political class simply share patronage based on their cynical exploitation of the fault lines of religion and ethnicity. Very often, we joke in Nigeria that when it comes to stealing and appropriation of state resources, there are no Muslims and there are no Christians, because they say a common prayer. Nepotism becomes a weapon of mass corruption in Africa when politicians present themselves as champions of either their ethnic groups or religious group. This exploitation prevents the true democratization and development of our countries across the board. Second, the governments in Africa, and I speak about Nigeria in particular, must develop a strong culture of and a legal basis for pursuing our common citizenship as enshrined in the Constitution, the supreme laws of our land. In our country, Nigeria, we find that most Muslims, especially in northern Nigeria, believe that somehow, even in a democracy, the Constitution is an inferior document and prefer that they live under Sharia law. Although the same Constitution accepts Sharia law, but only as it applies to personal matters. But we have seen constantly an assault on the Constitution and an unwillingness to subscribe to the fine principles that celebrate our diversity as provided for in the Constitution. And I speak here of provisions towards national cohesion that include intermarriages among citizens, but which in many parts of northern Nigeria, we're told that the prescription for a marriage between a Christian and a Muslim, except it is a Christian girl marrying a Muslim, which happens very frequently, but the idea of a young a young Christian boy marrying a Muslim girl, we're told, and it's popular, that the punishment for that is death. The tragedy, of course, is that the elite say and do nothing. And my argument has always been that it is the elite disposition that predisposes and expands the frontiers of violence by extremists. Thirdly, it is clear to us now that we're all at risk from the hands of these terrorists who use ethnicity and religion to destroy our common humanity. Whether we call them Boko Haram or ISIS or other ethnically or racially based groups, we must all stand together and insist that injury to one is injury to all. Fourthly, a comprehensive integrated program of education remains the cure for extremism. It is not enough for leaders of faith to continue to engage in mere moral rhetoric and meaningless dialogue designed to appease donors while leaving our people victims. As I've said in Nigeria and seen and elsewhere, the first victims of religiously inspired violence by extremists is always their own people. And when we speak in many parts of Nigeria, my Muslim brothers tend to say, well, stop complaining. They're not only killing Christians, they're killing Muslims too. But my response to all of this is, if your son steals from me, you don't console me by telling me he's also stealing from you. In today's world, these victims are often Muslims. And in northern Nigeria, majority of those who have died in the hands of Boko Haram and ISWAP, bandits and kidnappers have been Muslims. In closing, I again commend this initiative. However, beyond conferences, we must develop a coherent program of lessons and agreed principles that we can learn and accept from one another. This cancer of weaponization of religion threatens all of us. And history shows us that the empires and emperors have had their day. The world will always be full of men and women with grand delusions about how they have been divinely sent to create a new world at the cost of human blood. However, we must work harder to cure them of their delusions by taking them out of circulation. Here, developing nations must do more than merely append their signatures to international laws that protect human rights. Religious bodies on their part, in collaboration with civil society, must work together to ensure a fairer world for all. Given the plurality of our societies, relations between Christians and Muslims and people based on ethnicity can be better improved if government avoid open discrimination based on other forms of identity. Whereas our religious beliefs and cultures must remain sources of law, the secular democracies must focus on the provisions of national constitutions. Thus, religious leaders should avoid the manipulation of identities and encourage areas of integration through education, common citizenship, intermarriages, and other forms of social cohesion anticipated and enshrined in our constitutions. Finally, a fundamental belief in human dignity and the sacred nature of the family binds us all together. Every one of us here today. Weaponizing identity through dubious and false religious and ethnic triumphalism, as the world has seen under apartheid, racism, Nazism, and only recently the tragedy in Rwanda, all of these only diminish our common humanity. The continued weaponization of identity in plural societies will only make progress impossible, national cohesion elusive, and development a dream deferred. Leaders of world religions must unite in the face of the forces of secularism and extremism, and there is a sense in which our silence in moments of severe danger and rupture of our societies in the name of religion only offers the greatest opening doors to extremism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Our next two speakers are both citizens of Indonesia. They represent the two largest Muslim organizations in Indonesia. Often in this country, as many of you know, but also many of you who are visiting us from abroad may not know, Indonesia is a multi-religious and pluralistic nation state. It's not a secular nation, but nor is Islam its state religion. There are multiple religions that are recognized as having equal status, and the Constitution of Indonesia guarantees freedom of worship, freedom of conscience. The two organizations in question are often referred to in Indonesia as Soko Negara atau Soko NKRI, Soko UD45, because the foundation of the Indonesian nation state, NKRI, means the Unitary State of the Republic of Indonesia. UD45 means the Constitution of Indonesia, which has Pancasila as its foundation. So what I said in Indonesian a moment ago is that these two organizations, Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, are regarded as the pillars which uphold the roof and the entire structure of Indonesia as a multi-religious and pluralistic nation state. So our first speaker, Kiai Imam Ad Darud Qutni, is here today representing the Nahdlatul Ulama Central Board. He will speak to us about a concept, but it's more than a concept. It's really a way of actualizing and inculcating within the Muslim community in Indonesia, particularly within the context of the Muhammadiyah, the idea I believe they refer to as Islam berkemajuan. And I believe that Kiai Imam will tell us about this. so that we can all learn from the experience of the Muhammadiyah and their particular strategies and practice in upholding the traditions of religious pluralism and tolerance in Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you for the good introduction. Let me convey the greeting of Muhammadiyah, the greeting of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm sorry. Well, peace be upon you, all of you, with the God providence within. I am representing Muhammadiyah, as said before, given the very core messages as delivered by His Excellency, the President of Nahdlatul Ulama, Kiai Haji Yahya Stakov, here yesterday, that we should prioritize the unity and also the common agreement on the promotion of the peace and the prosperity on behalf of the religious leaders gathering here. Muhammadiyah, in line with this, also as the standard bearer of the progressive Islam, always convey the peace messages to the nation, even though my text is black out, so excuse me, say it directly. Muhammadiyah, always in line with the messages of the President of Nahdlatul Ulama yesterday, always convey the peace. And from the earliest time, Muhammadiyah try at first promote the modernization in terms of the apparatus and appliances of the education, modernization in terms of the education system. Then now, since 2004, Muhammadiyah declared the urgency of promoting the progressive Islam. The progressive Islam deals with the ideas of the external or influenced by external and internal factors. External factors dealing with the deteriorating conditions of the human civilizational heritages because of, to some extent, the excessive practices of our democracy that we have been confessing so far. Many parts of the world has been now jammed down to the ruins of the civilizational grandeur and splendor, particularly in Africa, some part in the Asian, Inner Asia, and also the part of the Iraq or Syria and so on and so forth. This is exactly not only dealing with the nations of the region, but it is also our identity, the identity of the world, all of us. It is also the identity of the democracy to be upheld together as of today. Nevertheless, Muhammadiyah sometimes is stigmatized as the radicals group of Islam and fundamentalists to some extent. But it is, I think, Muhammadiyah think that it is misconceived to some extent and also misunderstood. Why? Even in Indonesia, we never, since the 100 years Muhammadiyah have dedicated their vision and mission, never think and a set of agenda to substitute any system of our country. The top of Muhammadiyah leader even had been one of the founding fathers of this Republic of Indonesia. And as of today, and currently, Muhammadiyah has been developing and continue developing the progress of the education system in part of our nation development. More than 100 years, Muhammadiyah has dedicated his vision and mission now. More than 200 universities of Muhammadiyah across the nation accommodate 1,000 of non-Muslim students who are pursuing their studies. In NTT, eastern part of Nusa Tenggara alone, the University of Muhammadiyah sometimes is put in a joke as the CMU. CMU is abbreviation of the Christian Muhammadiyah University. This is a fact. So, but in Papua, the majority of the students are Christian too. And 65 of the students are Christian. When there took place the riot as the aftermath of the reform in 1998, Muhammadiyah buildings, the eastern part of Indonesia, defended by the Christian people too. So this is now Muhammadiyah promoting this progressive Islam just in terms of promoting how we should revitalize our democracy, not to be excessive. We should be a democratic people and should be the defender of the prosperity of the world and the civilization. That's all, and thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much, Kak Imam. Our next speaker is very well known in Indonesia. His name is Kiai Haji Ulil Abshar Abdallah. He is the chairman of Lakpesdam, which is the Institute for Study and Development of Human Resources within Nahdlatul Ulama. He was appointed to this position last January when Kiai Haji Yadul Istakuf became the chairman of the Central Board. He has an extremely profound responsibility because Nahdlatul Ulama has been moving for a number of years, laying the foundation for something that in Indonesian we refer to as, or in Arabic I should say, referred to as fiqh al-hadara, fiqh peradaban, or civilizational fiqh, an understanding of Islamic law suitable for the modern civilization that we are inhabiting, where Muslims and non-Muslims are dwelling side by side. This is a very old experience within Indonesia. You could say in many ways the roots of fiqh al-hadara lie within the Malay Archipelago, lie within the roots of Indonesian Islam. But in a global environment, Nahdlatul Ulama has concluded, having faced challenges from ISIS, having faced challenges from various Islamist and extremist groups, It's essential to position this within the theological and legal framework of Islam. And so, Nahdlatul Ulama, rather than anticipate what Khalil will say, I will simply say that he is leading a process under the guidance of Kyai Haji Yael Stakov in order to develop and socialize this idea of civilizational fiqh throughout the Nahdlatul Ulama. If you would, please.
Good morning. Good morning. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let me begin my speech by telling you a story. In 70s of last century, Kiai Haji Abdul Rahman Wahid, or as widely known as Gus Dur, our former president and our former general chairperson of Nahdlatul Ulama, was invited to give a lecture in a Christian seminary in Malang, East Java. Gus Dur was still young by then, and he accepted the invitation. So he went to this Christian seminary in Malang, in East Java, and gave a lecture or presentation about Islam. But the controversy ensued or followed after Gus Dur came home. News spread out about his going and visiting and giving a lecture in Christian seminary. Some traditional ulama or cleric of our organization objected very much to Gus Dur giving a lecture in Christian seminary. That was in 70s. I can describe that period, borrowing from the Catholic terminology, as our pre-Vatican II moment in our history in Nahdlatul Ulama. At that time, the idea of interreligious dialogue wasn't known or popular among our scholars or intellectual or ulama. Then, moving forward, in 80s of last century, 1980s, Kiai Haji Abdul Rahman Wahid or Gus Dur became one of the important icon and symbol of the interfaith dialogue. And by then, Gus Dur became the president or the general chairperson of Nahdlatul Ulama. And Gus Dur initiated a series of dialogue, of interfaith dialogue. And Gus Dur is one of the most important intellectual, thinker, and also ulama who was responsible for setting in motion a series of dialogue, interfaith conversation, and also produce a new generation of Muslim thinkers and intellectuals who were active in interfaith dialogue, including me. Today, Nahdlatul Ulama sponsored, initiated, in collaboration with Rabita Alam al-Islami, to organize this very ambitious forum to bring together leaders from different faith, tradition, religion, to sit together in Bali, in the land of God, as local say. This is the land of God. Can you imagine the journey from 70s to 2022? The journey from Gus Dur being criticized because of giving lecture in Christian seminary to today, this morning, the same organization, the same ulama, and today we see this forum. I think this is a quite remarkable journey. I would say that this is a Copernican revolution or Copernican leap from 70s to 2022. So our leaders, Kiai Yahya Stakov, for me or for us in Nahdlatul Ulama, is the continuation of this journey. He initiated this forum believing that Islam and all religion can contribute to solve the current problem that we face in modern time. Starting from August this year, Nahdlatul Ulama launched a project called Halaqah Fikih Peradaban. The goal is to encourage the ulama, our ulama who are affiliated with Nahdlatul Ulama, to do what some Muslim thinkers in Arab countries call i'adatul qira'ah, or rereading, namely rethinking our tradition and recontextualizing our tradition in the light of our current social, cultural, political, and economical context. Ladies and gentlemen, Muslims are not alone in encountering the challenge posed by modernity. The challenge can be summed up in the following question: how far can we be still anchored and rooted in our tradition without losing relevance in modern society? How can we be Muslim or Jews or Christian, Hindus, Buddhists, etc., in the sense of being faithful, loyal to our tradition, and yet remain relevant in modern society? Or, as some Arab Muslim thinkers in Middle East term it, as the mushkila, the challenge of al-asala wal-hadatha. That's the biggest challenge of Muslim today. Jews, Christian, and Muslim, I name only these three religions since they share common ancestry. Jews, Christian, and Muslim have one thing in common. They inherit textual tradition in the form of exegetical corpus called tafsir, produced by religious scholars or ulama of a span of centuries in the past. Those textual traditions constitute a foundation upon which the society of believers or ummah is founded. Jews, Christian, and Muslim share common religious experience, namely the experience as the society of text, mujtama'un nas. Scripture, which literally means a written document or written thing, lies at the heart of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim religious and spiritual life. An Egyptian scholar who happened to visit my father-in-law's house in Rembang in Central Java, his name is Professor Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, aptly characterized Islamic civilization as the civilization of text, or hadaratun nas. In a nutshell, we cannot understand the mechanic of Islamic society or other religious society, including Christian and Jewish, without paying serious attention to the texts around which Muslim life revolve. However, in the context of Islam, there is no single text. There is one single text with capital T that constitute the foundational text, or An-Nasul Mu'assis, from which all other texts come from. And that is the Quran and Sunnah, or the prophetic tradition. These texts give rise to thousands of texts, other texts written by the ulama, by the scholars, by the cleric in the past. And this thousands of texts in the form of exegetical corpus that explain and interpret the Quran and Sunnah became the foundation of the Muslim life throughout the centuries. The problem is, and this is the problem that Muslim, Christian, and Jews share, as Rabbi Sylvina Shemen quite wonderfully speak about it in her passionate speech. The problem is that these texts, these 1,000 texts were written in a different context. This is the problem. And Nahdlatul Ulama literally means the awakening of traditional religious ulama, or religious scholars. We inherit this rich tradition of text. The problem is that these texts were written in the different context, different situation. Our challenge today, as a Muslim, as a member of Nahdlatul Ulama, or as Nahdiyin, is to rethink, reinterpret, reevaluate our understanding, our interpretation of this text. Nahdlatul Ulama, under the guidance of Kiai Yahya Khalil Stakuf, initiated from August this year a series of seminar called Halaqah of Fiqh Peradaban. And these seminars are, the goal is to encourage our ulama to rethink, to do i'adatul qira'ah, to do rereading and rethinking of our tradition. It started from August, and we are going to organize 250 halaqah seminars in the span of 5 months. And I'm responsible for organizing this halaqah, and the response of the kiai, of the ulama, of our leaders and scholars are quite enthusiastic, which is quite, for me, is surprising. There is no moment of ulama questioning me or Kiai Yahya why organizing this seminar or this halaqah, because this halaqah is trying to criticize and also contextualize and rethink our tradition. So this is, I think, a good progress in Nahdlatul Ulama. And I believe that this halaqah will produce a new generation of kiai, of ulama, who can contextualize Islamic tradition within the modern context. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Our final speaker in the session is a native of Turkey. He lives currently and teaches in the United States at San Diego State University. He's an expert on global Islam and thinks deeply about all of these issues. We've asked Professor Ahmet Kuru to deliver a summary of his assessment of what all these organizations are doing, because prior to coming here, what all of these organizations are doing is already the subject of his academic study.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I am honored to be in this historic event, especially this seminal panel. Thankful to Pak Yahya, Holland Taylor, and Tim Shah and other organizers. In 4 days, it will be my 50th birthday. When I was born, half a century ago in Turkey. It was the high moment of secularism worldwide as a political trend. And when I decided to become a practicing Muslim, I faced some level of discrimination, and especially my wife, wearing a scarf, faced official discrimination in Turkish secular structure. But gradually, eventually, there is a religious revival worldwide. Hence, it made me happy with the expectation of expanding of religious freedoms. Global changes, including Iranian revolution, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the worldwide decline of socialism, the rise of evangelicals in the United States, religious parties in Israel, BJP in India, and Islamism worldwide. But I am not happy with this religious revival, and I am not alone. When we look at American society in the last 10 years, the percentage of unaffiliated people with no religion jumped from 15% to 25%. In Iran, according to a recent survey, more than half of the people define themselves no longer Muslim. In Turkey, the Director of Religious Affairs, Diyanet, recently admitted that there is a rising deism even in Islamic schools. Why? What's happening? My short answer is politicization of religion. The alliance between clergy and political rulers, especially in authoritarian countries, push young generation to secularism. And this clergy-state alliance has deep historical roots. In the Muslim world, the golden era of science and philosophy between 8th to 12th centuries really ended with the rise of ulama-state alliance. And more recently, with the religious revival I emphasize, we see now the combination of GOP, Republican Party, and evangelicals in the United States, the rise of Hindu nationalism in India, Diyanet as the partner of Tayyip Erdogan's regime in Turkey, Iran ruled by the clergy, LSR part and Grand Mufti part of the Sisi regime, and all of them mean that religion is becoming part of right-wing populism, which brings together religion, nationalism, and a demagogic political leadership. And what about the impact? It's mostly certain danger to religious minorities, and we have been hearing in this panel and others. And when religious minorities persecuted, attacked by right-wing governments, it's mostly secularists defend. In the United States, when Trump pushing the Muslim ban, it was ACLU, the most secularist institution, defend Muslim rights. When in India, Muslims face persecution, it's the secularists in India who defend them. And when Uyghur Muslims in China persecuted, Muslim Islamic governments didn't support them, neither Saudi Arabia, nor Indonesia, nor several other countries, you name it, which gives the idea that secularists are for human rights and minority rights, and religious leaders are mostly for majoritarian domination of their majoritarian religion. So this is truly a challenge, and for me, it may mean the rise of certain level of secularist backlash coming in the future. And the solution, I think this panel asks the rightful question about these concerns. What can we do? What values do our respective traditions need to promote to ensure that religion functions as a source of genuine solution, not problem, in the 21st century? And the panelists already gave excellent answers. They each provided bold and insightful remarks about how to reform Jewish, Mormon, Christian, and Muslim traditions within their own criteria, particularly on the issue of minority rights. They have emphasized that majority religions should defend a moral ground against the persecution of others and religious minorities, so that religious stands would help the establishment of equal citizenship. So I had the privilege to read 4 of the papers before the panel, and if I briefly mention them, Rabbi Professor Alan Brill and Rabbi Sylvina Chaman referred to a seminal reformist document, The Status of Non-Jews in the Jewish Land and Jewish Law, and this document is crucial for the future relations between Jews and non-Jews, particularly Muslims and Christian Arabs. Then Imam Ad-Dararukhnitni explained how Muhammadiyah has pursued a reformist agenda for progressive Islam. And my friend Mas'ulil Abdullah explained how Indonesia's Nahdlatul Ulama has had a historic initiative, humanitarian Islam, which focus on rahmah, loosely translated as love and compassion, and it reformed Islamic thought on controversial issues, including equal citizenship and relations with non-Muslims. And this humanitarian Islam was very important for me in the United States when my students were all reading about the Taliban's retaking power in Afghanistan, and the media was full of news about that. The Conversation.com approached me to write and show the diverse visions of Islam. And then I pick up humanitarian Islam with on the three issues that try to reform Islamic thought. One issue is the leadership caliphate, emphasizing that modern state with its democratic structure is perfectly fine. The second is the issue of equal citizenship. Non-Muslims should not be discriminated as secondary citizens. And the third issue is the legitimacy of the law parliaments are making without really promoting the Islamist agenda of Sharia-based Islamic State, but legitimizing the secular or parliamentary structure. And then when I teach my students and wrote the article about humanitarian Islam, it really makes them, give them idea that it's not all about Taliban, but there are other visions, and a major vision coming from Indonesia, and hopefully it may have an impact in the long run, even in the Middle East. So the discussions in this panel about reforming religious traditions within themselves, particularly on the issue of minority rights, is very promising and motivating. This is the true direction to make religions function as a source of solution, not a problem, in the 21st century. And my talk has been like a social scientific presentation, and let me conclude with a religious tone and the inclusive message of the Quran, chapter 2, verse 62. Truly those who believe, and those who are Jews, Christians, and Sabians, whoever believes in God and the last day, and whoever does righteous deeds, have their reward with their Lord. No fear shall come upon them, nor shall they grieve. Thank you.
In wrapping up this session, I'll just tell an anecdote here about Kai Haji Yahya Stakov. By the way, thank you, Ahmet. But Yahya is very, very familiar with this teshuvah that was created by the Rabbinical Assembly. He studied it in length. He also is quite familiar with the structure of the Masorti movement, their way of approaching all this. And often in the context of his addresses, you can imagine being the chairman of the world's largest Muslim organization. He's constantly on the move. He's constantly addressing domestic audiences. Actually, he has very much less time now for international engagement than he did prior to becoming the chairman of the Central Board of Nahdlatul Ulama. But in traveling around Indonesia, and I've heard him many times reference this teshuvah from the Rabbinical Assembly. And every time he references it, because as you can readily imagine within Muslim communities, not only due to the conflict between Israel and Palestine, but also due to a long history between Islam and Judaism, and a history of warfare between Islam and Christianity that goes back millennia, there can be a certain mindset, and the same is absolutely true in reverse, that in terms of a prejudicial mindset. And whenever Bat Yahya speaks about this teshuvah, he knows it has two distinct effects. One effect is it reduces anti-Semitism. The very fact that a Masorti movement, which is based on halakha, but believes in the recontextualization of Jewish teachings, has honestly identified those elements within classical Jewish law which can lead to persecution and violence against non-Jews. The very fact that the Masorti movement has acknowledged this and addressed it and said we need to recontextualize our teachings and move beyond this history of conflict with non-Jews is something that has an immediate effect upon Muslims, which is this is a wonderful thing that these rabbis are doing. And it has a distinct effect both to reduce anti-Semitism and to inspire the thought this would be a very relevant process within Islam itself. And this is the precise thing that Kai Haji Ulil Abshar Abdallah is responsible for, and that Imam Ad-Daraqutni and Islam Barkamajuan and the Muhammadiyya are doing. So I want to thank all of our guests here today for speaking, for coming such a long distance. And I want to thank all of you for your patience with us, and I hope you found this session stimulating.
Mr. Holland, now we would like to have a token of appreciation. I would like to invite Mrs. Safira Mahrusa to deliver the token of appreciation. All right. Now, again, we would like to invite Ambassador, His Excellency Ambassador Safira Mahrusa to deliver the token of appreciation to all the speakers and also the moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite you to give a big round of applause to our speakers and also moderator. All right, after the token of appreciations, we also would like to give the certificate to all our speakers. Thank you very much for all your perspective and thought to the 4th plenary session for this morning. All right, ladies and gentlemen, token of appreciation and certificate already delivered. Now we have the photo group sessions. All right, for all the speakers, His Excellency Ambassador Safira Mahrusa will have a photo session. All right, please give a big round of applause to our beloved speaker and also moderator. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and now you may return to your seat. All right, ladies and gentlemen, to have a little bit of enjoying, so we would like to give you a time to having an enjoy coffee break and toilet break for about 5 minutes.